Okay, so we're prepping. I'm here with Ross McQuivy, prepping for a sermon in a few weeks on Hebrews 11. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and screen share right now. Ross, tell me if you can see this.
Yep, I
So
got you.
you see my screen. So just for people who want to know where to find this sermon, it's because it's coming up. We're going to find it under Sermon Link schedule, and it is at the end of this month, isn't it?
Yep.
So Hebrews, July 26, Hebrews 11 and the American Dream, and I'll go ahead and leave this up on my screen. And so what I was going to do is, I think a good way, one of my favorite ways to prep with other people is just kind of to talk through it sort of conversationally, you know. And so let's just take a few minutes and kind of talk through the main points, and then without getting into too many details, and then what I like to do is come down here to the discussion questions at the bottom of the post, and I actually like to hit some of these discussion questions. In fact, we might even start with that, at least a couple of them, to get us warmed up,
Okay.
because then I think it helps you to make the sermon conversational, because the goal is to empower conversations, right? Mentoring conversations in small groups, and that sort of thing.
Yep.
So why don't we do this? Let's start with the excerpt, the big idea here. I'll go ahead and read this. Faith makes us look at everything differently. It changes our priorities, changes the purpose of our lives. It affects the things we dream to achieve, causes us to reevaluate what matters most in life, and leads us to live according to God's plans for us. So the angle on this one, from the Hebrews 11 thing, the angle on this one is really sort of setting up the foil of the American dream, but talking about how Abraham is a great example of a guy who wasn't chasing that dream. Instead of pursuing the American dream, he pursued God. And so that's kind of the thing I want us to keep in mind as we're talking through this, to make sure, Ross, that you get clarity on that idea. And for me, it's helpful to talk it through to be able to get greater clarity on it. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So let's go down here, before we get into the talking points, let's go down to the discussion questions. We'll skip number 2. What was your dream job when you were a kid? I mean, I guess we shouldn't skip that. That might be a good one, because that, as you process that, Ross, that might end up working its way into the sermon, right?
Okay. So dream job as a kid, probably would have to be being a lifeguard. And it was just because it was cush. You get to sit in the chair, take in the rays, take in the scenery, and rarely were you called to duty.
Now that's pretty funny, and I do think that might work its way into your sermon. Let's keep that in mind.
Okay.
Question 3 I think is important for us to take a few minutes on in prep, and the question is, what is the American dream?
Yeah.
Wait, before you explain, I think the reason this is important is, I think if we're not clear on what we mean by the American dream, then I think it's going to be hard to preach the sermon, because the sermon is saying, don't chase after the American dream, chase after God instead, right? So.
Yep. So in my mind, the American dream is the faith that we hold as Americans, that through hard work, through courage, through determination, we can achieve a better life for ourselves, and it's usually through financial means. It's usually a reliance on ourselves and our finances, a bigger house, a nicer car, being able to live that cush life like I did sitting in the lifeguard chair, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's good. Yeah, so that I think both of those could work themselves into your sermon.
Okay.
Right? Because you could.
Yep.
I mean, you can even reference that as just say, hey, one of the questions this week is, what was your dream job? That's a great way to sort of intro your sermon.
Yeah.
And then a pretty easy transition to talk about the American dream.
Yep.
And I would even encourage you to do it just like that. Just say, reference the questions in the resources, because that's one of the things you're trying to do anyway, is connect it to the resources.
Okay.
And so it says make a short list of the American dream, and so you said nice car, nice house. What else would you put
Right.
on?
Just financial prosperity.
Yeah.
You're always chasing that next dime, that next dollar, hoping that, if I could just make just this little bit more, I'd be comfortable.
Mm.
I'd be happier if I could just make just this little bit more. And yeah, as you find out, you never make enough. It will continue no matter how much we end up making it. You continue to chase your tail.
Well, yeah, so that I guess relates to that second half of the question. Do most people achieve it in their lifetime?
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, I think we're constantly looking for something else, whether it's trying to keep up with the Joneses or trying to keep up with yourself. Um, it seems like it's a constant battle that we never really catch. Uh, Regardless of how big a pile of stuff we have or that we've accumulated, there's always something else that we want to get our hands on.
So do you personally, let's get personal for a second because this might work its way in. Do you personally know some people that you feel like have achieved the American dream and are happy about it and feel content and
Yeah, that's a
satisfied?
good. Yeah, that's a good question. Off the top of my head, I think of some of the people that I know that have had great success and whatnot. Sort of the rags to riches stories. But I don't know them well enough to be able to say, are they truly happy, or is it just a perception from outside? Us outsiders looking in, going, "Wow, they must be living the dream because." Here they are, 42 years old and retired and doing anything they want, travel anywhere they want with their family, take them anywhere they want, and they're just sort of quote unquote living the dream. Um, but I don't know what that means in their heart. You know what I'm saying?
Mm. Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. And again, I'm not trying to get full answers to that. I think this is just good for us to start processing this and for anyone watching the video to be answering some of these questions for themselves. So here's another question, Ross. Your definition of the American dream was almost entirely about money. Do you think that some people might expand that to other things besides material stuff? I think material stuff is, I think it's good. I think that needs to be probably the main thing because that's the main thing people think of. But
Yeah.
would the average American throw something else on that list?
Well, possibly, climbing the corporate ladder, whether it's tied financial prosperity or not, achieving sort of that a higher standard in society or in your workplace, moving up the ladder. Um, so,
Yeah, good. So that would be maybe the word for that is status.
yep,
So the first word would be what? Would be money
money, yeah,
or 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 wealth or riches or something like that. So riches.
yep,
I know when I take notes, I like to write some of these keywords down to try to keep coming back to them, make sure that I've got clear in my mind what do I mean by the American dream and why is it so bad anyway, right?
yeah, yep.
So wealth, status. Would there be a would there be another thing on the American dream list, short list?
Um,
Like I wonder if some people would say like health,
yeah, yeah,
like long life. I'm
yep,
I'm not going to let sickness won't get in my way because I know some people that were very wealthy who got Steve Jobs, he was
yeah,
he had wealth and status and then he got cancer and realized
yep,
he didn't control as much as he thought he did.
yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a good point, and it really goes back to the whole where sort of the American dream comes from, and the Declaration of Independence and our forefathers saying, we have these unalienable rights, such as that health and pursuit of happiness. I can't remember what they are. I should.
Yeah.
I should know it, but pursuit of
life. Was it life, liberty?
Life, liberty. Yeah, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah. Ooh, that's good. Yeah, so I think that's a good point. I think coming back to where that even stems from, it stems from that, right?
Yep.
And certainly what they meant, who knows exactly what they meant, the founding fathers meant by that, but I think we take that to mean something, everyone sort of takes that to mean something a little different, right?
Yeah. Yep.
What is happiness to me? And, you know, happiness is money, status, and health, and,
yep,
you know, whatever else.
Yep.
And so that really relates to question 5 here. I don't know if you can read it, but it says make a list of the top 5 priorities of your neighbors and coworkers.
Okay.
And that might be a good one to think about. We won't answer that now. And number 6 is the other side of that. Make a list of the top 5 priorities that Christians should have. Mm-hmm. And I think that's that might even be a good exercise in prepping for this sermon, is to make those 2 lists and see what shows up on those lists. And potentially even share those lists during your sermon, or parts of those lists, and just say, you know, my wife and I went through this exercise, because that could really inspire, you know, some other husband and wife sitting out there to maybe do that, right?
Yeah, I like that.
Those are just easy, really great sort of hook sort of things to get people engaged in this, because what you've got to do, especially at the beginning, is you've got a few minutes to convince your hearers that they want to keep listening. Mm-hmm. You know, are they going to just tune out? So that's why it's good to sort of think through this. What's the issue here? What's the hook that's going to get someone to say, why should I keep listening to this guy?
Yep.
And of course, we're not just thinking about Christians. We're thinking about that. I always like to think about that husband who shows up and doesn't really want to be there, but he's trying to be a good husband or good dad. Because I think this sermon really would appeal to that guy.
Yeah.
If you can get it across, right? And that's the key. All right, I'm going to go back up to the top of this again. I'm going to read this excerpt again at the top, now that we've had a little bit of a warm-up conversation. So faith makes us look at everything differently. So it changes our priorities, our purpose. It even affects the things we dream to achieve. Okay, so there's that American dream. So you notice what we're doing is we're taking, on one side, we're taking the American dream, and then on the other side, we're taking this thing called faith. Okay, so I'm going to just jump down to the bottom here again. I think a resource that's really worth taking a look at. I always like to look at when I'm prepping a sermon, I like to look at the related resources.
Okay.
You know, so there's stuff on where do you stand in your faith and getting to your faith moment, but this one in particular, what does faith look like, is a good one.
Okay.
Because this is kind of like Scott wrote this one as kind of like almost like an intro to the series.
Okay.
This wasn't a sermon, but it's just really good. It talks about how faith is central to Christianity, and it really sort of digs into this key verse, Hebrews 11, 1 through 2. This is sort of the key verse for the whole series. So the key verse for your sermon is that, we'll get to that, but it's at verse 8 or 9 or whatever. But this is really sort of that key verse that I think for every sermon in the series we should keep this one in mind. And it says, faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see. So then it says, through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. So then it lists out those guys, right? And Abraham is what, the 4th one on the list. Mm-hmm. So let's look at verse 1 there again. It says, it defines faith. It's confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see. So how does this relate to the American dream?
I think those who hold the American dream also have faith that even though they may not see the end at this moment, they have faith that their hard work, that their due diligence, that their all of that will lead them to, you know, that potentially or finally achieving this dream.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. And so really, you're talking about what we hope for, right? So I'm going to highlight this so you can see it. What we hope for.
Yep.
So on the one side, what we hope for from the American dream is that list we just made, right?
Correct.
But then the foil, or the other side of that, then is going to be, well, what, as a Christian, as a pursuer of God, what should we hope for?
Yeah.
So keep that in mind as we talk through this. This is Hebrews 11:1 is a good one to just write down, have kind of in your notes.
Yep.
Make some marks on it as we're going through it, because the two things, well, there's a few things. I like the word confidence.
Mm-hmm.
I like the phrase what we hope for.
Mm-hmm.
And then I like the phrase right here, things we cannot see.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're going to come back to that things we cannot see. I'm going to go back to the Abraham sermon now, because this now brings us into that first point. So the first point, well, Hebrews 11:8, here's the key verse. It was by faith, and so this is what, 7 verses later, that Abraham obeyed God when he called him to leave home and go to another land that he would give him as an inheritance. And so here's the key, right here it is. He went without knowing where he was going.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an important, you know, we need to make sure we understand that phrase because that's kind of a key phrase in the whole sermon and this relates to the Hebrews 11:1 definition, right?
Yep.
So he went without knowing where he was going, so it's kind of the things unseen thing, right?
Yep.
And so there's your first talking point. Faith leads us into the unknown. And so I like that. This is what I do. In my notes, I would circle this word unknown. I would really that's kind of my key word for my first talking point.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about this for Abraham real quick first, and then let's talk about it for your own life to see if you can relate to it and then help other people relate to it. So what does it mean that it was the unknown for Abraham?
Well, he was leaving everything that he knew. He was being told to go to some totally different place, essentially without family, without friends, with, you know.
Yeah, that's great. And he says it right here. This will be another slide for the sermon. So again, your slides in the package are going to be Hebrews 1:8, that'll be a slide. This will be a talking point, and then Genesis 12:1 will be a slide.
Okay.
And so even as you just explain that, you can explain it. You know, what you could say is, okay, let's go to Genesis 12:1. Let's go back to the Old Testament and see what the author of Hebrews is talking about. Okay, so 3 things he left: your native country, your relatives, and your father's family. So, you know, like you said, everything he was comfortable with, everything he knew, everything that was known to him, right?
Yep.
And the other thing is, and then in verse 4, I think that'll be a slide also. In verse 4, here's another point I would make, is he was 75 years old when he did it.
Yeah, yeah.
So those are what I would call nuggets, you know. He wasn't a young guy. This wasn't like, you know, 21-year-old. He had his whole life in front of him. Like it's a little easier, I think, to take risks when you're younger.
Yep.
That's why young golfers are better putters.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't. They'll have more of those. You know, it doesn't mean as much to them.
Yep.
And I like what it says here. He didn't know where he was going, but he was willing to follow God. So for us, a life of faith will mean trusting God to lead us down unknown paths. Okay, so let's go back up to this for you now. Any other comments about Abraham? So really what you're doing is you're not trying to this sermon is really unfolds well, I think, as you're setting up the American dream thing, right? You're getting people thinking about the American dream, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? And you don't even really have to tell them that at the beginning.
Right.
You're saying we're gonna examine the American dream and our pursuit of it, right?
Yep.
And then you go into the story, so now you're setting the story up, you're explaining Abraham and why he's important. So Abraham is an example of this first thing, that he was willing to go into the unknown. I think this is a good place somewhere in here to think about that for your own life, whether it's a spiritual example or just a funny example. Okay. Of a time when faith is not even faith, but just a time when you went into the unknown. Like, how would you personally relate to that?
Yeah, one of the things that I actually was discussing with Mar earlier was, and it's not a faith one, and so I don't know how appropriate it is, but it's the transition that one goes through when you're a medical student on June 30th. And you're the physician on July 1st, and you go from watching and holding retractors to actually holding the scalpel and cutting someone open and doing the procedure overnight. And it's truly an unknown experience.
Yeah. No, that's great. I think that's a great example.
Okay.
And if it's an example that's a little less about faith, then what I would do is I would put it more toward the beginning of the point.
Okay.
If it was an example more about faith, I would put it after you make the faith connection, right?
Yeah.
So what I would do is I would set up the point. I would say, so here's the first thing we learned, and then the slide comes up. Faith leads us into the unknown. We're going to see this in Abraham's story. But first, I got to tell you my story, right?
Okay.
And so your emphasis, your keyword is the unknown, right?
Yep.
You set it up, people laugh, they're engaged, but now you go right back to the story. Now let's see how Abraham wasn't a doctor, but let's see how Abraham was led into the unknown, and then Genesis 12:1, right?
I like that.
And then, again, if verse 4 is a slide, you throw that up. Once you get into the country, relatives, and father's family, spend a minute or two on that if you want to just to say, I mean, how hard must that have been for this guy, right?
Yep.
Play with that idea for a little bit, and then that 75-year-old thing is kind of just the icing on the cake, right? And there's one more thing we see in verse 4. He was 75. He wasn't even a young guy. Like, I can understand if he was stupid 18-year-old, He was 75. Maybe say something about your dad. My dad is not even 75.
Yep.
Throw Mar under the bus. No, wait, this isn't the time, but eventually we're going to find a place to throw your wife under the bus. Okay, so the point there is, okay, so then he comes back to it in this. Many of us are chasing some version of the American dream in our lives. We want to have family, great career, accomplish our goals for life. Abraham had goals too, but God interrupted them. I really like this.
Yeah.
I would circle the word interrupted.
Yep.
So what you're doing now is you're bringing it back to the overall big idea, which is about the American dream, right?
Yep.
And again, you're not trying to you're driving the point home increasingly as you move through the sermon. So don't feel like you got to tie everything up in a pretty little ribbon. You know, this is still the first movement of 3 in the sermon. Well, maybe 4. The first movement is really the setup, and then there's 3 talking points. So I would say there's 4 total movements, and then the close, right? So, you know, you're getting people you're slowly revealing and helping them discover this truth you're trying to lead them to, right?
Right.
So the unknown thing is the first thing. All right. So then he shifts. The second point is that faith forces us to change our priorities. And then, you know, this really kind of gets to the question we already started talking about, questions 5 and 6, about the top 5 priorities.
Right.
So this is now we're starting to get a little bit, what I would say is the unknown is kind of the big picture, is sort of like the broadest view of this. And now we're starting to talk about priorities, which to me, now we're starting to get specific, right? Okay. So we've got, you know, he says here, perhaps before becoming a Christian, your priorities were money, security, influence, or power. We hit most of those on our list.
Mm-hmm.
All of these make up, to varying degrees, the American dream. But the idea is, and this is the idea that will be hard to convince people of a little bit, but when God gets a hold of us, he calls us to change our priorities.
Mm-hmm.
So my first question for you is, before we even get into Abraham, how is that true for you?
Yeah, well, it certainly is an experience, you know, that I went through, you know, as I had my defining moment and became a Christian and started to develop a relationship with God. You know, my focus became much less about that, you know, the money, security, and power. And I started to see my focus shifting, obviously, towards God, towards, you know, trying to establish a relationship with Him, also towards my family, and how I can help them pursue that and have a relationship with God.
Yeah, that's good. And I notice the key word there is relationship.
Yeah.
Which didn't make any of our American Dream lists.
Yep.
And I think that's a good, simple way to explain it. Is your focus change? You know, Matthew 22 is a great example, because Jesus says the greatest commandment is love God and then love people as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing about money, security, or power, or status, or anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's great. I think that's a great, you know, I think this is a great place for you to share that personally. I think that'll make the biggest impact in this sermon.
Okay.
Is when you're explaining this point, when you make it personal.
Yep.
You know, to even admit that sometimes you get pulled back into chasing the American dream or chasing the buck, you know.
Yep.
Because I think that's what guys will connect with. And you notice we don't have any Abraham in this talking point. What we do is we go to, Jesus says, Matthew 6:33, seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and He will give you everything you need.
Yep.
And so, you know, what he's saying is, above all else, there's your priority word, right?
Yep.
So make God a priority, and then He'll give you everything you need. Interestingly, it doesn't say He will give you everything you want.
Yes. Yeah, I like that point.
And so those are, you know, again, to me, this is really this second point, I think, is an opportunity for you to really sort of be personal and drive home what it means to you that your pursuit of God has changed your priorities, and has just changed your life, right?
Yeah.
So that's how I would view that. I view this as your little testimony point right here.
Okay.
You know, maybe if you haven't yet referred to the top 5 priority, you know, these 2 questions, that might be a good place to refer to these 2 questions, you know.
Yeah. Yep.
And then that moves you into that 3rd point, which is that faith focuses on the eternal. And now we return to Hebrews 11, and it says, verse 9, and when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith, for he was like a foreigner living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham, this to me is another nugget. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God.
Mm-hmm.
So the interesting point that he makes right here is he was wealthy and respected in his new land, yet Abraham didn't build a city. Mm-hmm. He lived in tents. And his son and his grandson, that's Isaac and Jacob, that was son and grandson.
Yep.
Look at this. 3 generations, and the promise still hadn't happened yet.
Yep.
And the point was, I like how Scott writes this, Hebrews interprets this life for us. They were seeking the eternal. This was their ultimate hope. So they weren't fixated on the American dream in this life, like amassing wealth and all that stuff.
Yep.
They had a bigger picture, and that's why they were able to live in tents. To me, that's such a great nugget, living in tents. I would circle that one and say, yeah. I would camp on that a little bit. In my story, I might say a little bit about my tent camping.
Okay.
And how terrible I am at that. It's not very glamorous, right?
No.
But that's the point. It wasn't glamorous, but he was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations. So he didn't fall for the idea that this life is all that there is. Because really, to me, that's what the American dream, at the root of the American dream is. You better get it now, because there's nothing beyond this.
That's a good point.
And that's kind of the close right there. Why should we give up on the American dream? It only focuses on the here and now. Focuses on the temporary. And then that goes back to your thing about how your priorities changed. Relationships are eternal. People are eternal. Your car is not going with you. Your house is not going with you. But your wife and kids will go with you. And anyone else you take. Anyone else that you help to pursue God, right?
Yep.
So I want to go back to this real quick. Go back to what does faith look like. Go back to verse 1, Hebrews 11:1. So faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. Because remember, what the author of Hebrews is doing is this is his theme verse, and he's showing in all of these different examples throughout the chapter how this is lived out in each person's life.
Mm-hmm.
And so
did I lose you, Brian?
there still?
Oh, yeah, you just kind of cut out.
Sorry. So faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see. So this really so clearly relates to that verse that we just looked at from, I think, verse 9 or 10, where Abraham, I mean, he even uses some of the same language. Mm-hmm. Confidently, well, not almost the same language, confidently looking forward to.
Yeah.
Hoping for. this
Yep.
unseen thing, right? Focusing
Yep.
on it's this eternal thing. So that's the movement. I always like to. I think the reason it's good to be conversational about it and to think about it in terms of the average guy listening out there. If you can have clarity in your mind about how all these things so simply tie together, then you can confidently get up there and just share this message from your heart, right?
Yep.
Because you have clarity on it. You have just real simple clarity on the whole thing.
Yep.
So you want to give it a shot? You want to give what in a phrase or two? Tell me what this sermon is about. What's the big idea?
The big idea in my mind is that that we need, well, that first faith is what's going to drive us to sort of our eternal destiny or our eternal reward. And if we can follow Abraham's example as one who's willing to follow God's will and not one's self-will, then the awards are going to be much greater than any sort of American dream or any sort of Ferrari that we may be able to end up buying here.
Good. Yeah, and I think what would be good is if you could do that even quicker, even shorter.
Yep.
I mean, I was listening for it, making sure you were going to say American Dream,
Yeah.
and you did. But what I like to do is think about saying that to your brother-in-law or a buddy of yours or a neighbor. Like he's over to your house, and he's saying, "I was thinking about coming to church." "Oh yeah, you should come." "Well, what are you guys talking about this week?" And that's how you would answer that question is the big idea.
Yep.
So, answering it for a guy that's not super spiritual. So, we're talking about how the American dream isn't all there is.
Mm-hmm.
And that when you meet Jesus, you've got more to live for, right? Something like that.
Yep. That helps, though. That's I think with time, that's gonna help. I'll be able to fine tune those thoughts and those.
Yeah.
So that's very helpful.
Yeah, and then to go back over those main talking points. Okay, so where are some of my stories that I'm going to share to illuminate? You got your unknown story, the doctor story. I think that was a great one. You've got your priorities. Basically your personal testimony on this point here.
Yep.
Because those are things that you don't have to script so much. Those are things that you try to just stick to your main themes so you're not too long-winded. But anytime you can get away from your notes and just share from your heart, it makes you comfortable. It makes other people comfortable.
Yep.
Transitions are always important. I always like to give a little extra attention to transitions when so I'll actually think about, okay, how am I going to transition from movement 1 to movement 2, this first talking point.
Yep.
How am I going to and actually say it, actually practice that transition. How am I going to transition from the end of this movement to the beginning of this movement?
Yep.
And then how am I going to transition here? And then how do I close the deal? Making sure that a lot of times you lose clarity as you close. You focused on everything else, and then you kind of fizzle out at the end a little bit.
Yeah. Yep.
I tend to do that. I recognize, I think about the sermon so much, but I don't really think about, so what's the takeaway? What's the challenge? What's my close? How do I wrap it up? Don't forget to wrap it up with strength. And reviewing these questions is always good. Just look at these questions. Even just talking through these questions with your wife, with other guys in your life in the weeks before you preach is just good, because the more you articulate it, in conversation, then the more comfortable you will be to articulate it from the pulpit.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments about that?
I don't think so. That was very helpful.
Good. Well, yeah, we'll wrap it up then, and again, this will be available. This video is available online at the bottom of that. We'll put this in the links and downloads at the bottom of that that sermon, so you can watch it again if you need to review it, and some of the other guys can do it as well. So I'm excited about you preaching it, Ross. I think you're going to do a great job.
Thanks, buddy. I'm looking